When you start learning jazz, then many of us can learn a lot about what notes to play very quickly, but just knowing all that stuff doesn't really help you sound like jazz at all. Back when I was living in Copenhagen and was just getting started with playing jazz guitar, then I had an easy time learning a lot of the things that my teacher would give me.
Play a C major 7 arpeggio. Okay, try to add a leading note before the root.
Most of the exercises like this one are not that difficult, but when you have to turn that into a jazz lick, that's another story.
Can you make a line with this?
I quickly became aware that just playing the exercises wasn't really getting me there. Something else was missing. And luckily I was also told to learn and play solos, so I checked out Sonny Stitt, Joe Pass and Charlie Parker lines. But I couldn't really get it to work. There was still one thing missing that took me quite a long time to figure out. In this video I'm going to first show you a basic exercise and what you need to practice to make it sound right. And this highlights something that I think is mostly overlooked when it comes to teaching jazz. Before we get into sort of more complicated chromatic stuff and scales, let's start with a very basic piece of vocabulary. Arpeggios. Now I'm sure you're already practicing arpeggios, and especially the diatonic arpeggios inside the scale, as I've talked about in other videos. Let me give you a few recipes that make them sound better in your solos. I clearly remember trying to use arpeggios in my solos and not really having any luck getting them to sound right. My teachers didn't really explain how they could be used, and I could just hear that it didn't work when I was trying. Now what was missing was that you need to think of the arpeggio not only as a set of notes or the right notes over a chord, because when you play it in a solo, it's also a melody, and melodies need to have the right flow. This is so simple, but it really works. As a first recipe, play up the arpeggio and then go down one step in the scale. So now in my example here, an arpeggio is a melody that quickly moves up almost an octave. So that's a lot of melodic tension or energy, and you can resolve this by just moving down again, and preferably in a more calm manner, like a step down the scale. So, and now your arpeggio lick starts like this. And then you can add more after that, maybe some chromatic notes and not ending on a downbeat. Now this is so strong and also very commonly used that you can even decide to practice this as a scale exercise to really get it into both your fingers and your ears. And of course, you need to explore more examples of how you can use it. So here's another example over a 2/5, and notice how the recipe really sort of drives the chord change as well. Melodies like this just dance more. They have a more interesting flow because you have these high notes on the offbeats. They really bring out the syncopation and the interesting rhythm in the lines. Now before we get to the chromatic tricks and the scales, let's look at another powerful arpeggio recipe. One way of using arpeggios that is a cornerstone in bebop vocabulary is playing them as triplets, like this. This is great for solving two problems that the previous recipe can't handle: targeting the top note of the arpeggio and adding chromatic notes after the arpeggio. And it's easy to hear how this sounds better than this. So instead, playing the arpeggio like this really lets you emphasize that last note in the arpeggio, and as a bonus, then it makes sense to actually add that chromatic run. You'll hear the bebop triplet arpeggio being used very often. Another common part of it is to have a chromatic leading note just before the arpeggio, as you'll see in the next example on a 2/5-1. And notice how you sometimes also want to anticipate the chord change by playing a chord tone on the forehand instead of having it on beat 1. Of course, just seeing an example or two that uses the arpeggios like this or has a more interesting rhythm similar to the previous example is not enough to immediately start sounding like that. So how do you practice towards getting this into your playing? The one thing that really doesn't work is to just put on iReal and then hope to magically be able to play lines like this. You first need to get these melodic techniques into your ears and make them connect with what you already know. For some reason, this is not something that we spend a lot of time talking about, but it is a huge gap in jazz education, as Pat Metheny also points out in the Rick Beato interview.
Well, you know, melody of the three branches of musical government is the one that you can't go to college for 4 years on. You can definitely go to college for 4 years on harmony.
Yeah.
And you can definitely go to college for 4 years on rhythm. Melody, your theory teacher is going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes about lyrical this and leap intervallic leaps that.
And that is really what this video is about, making lines that have melodies that work for bebop. The way you practice this slowly is composing melodies, which in this case is licks. Whatever melodic technique you want to get into your playing, start by writing licks, 10, 50, 100 licks to really explore how it sounds and how it fits with what you play and what you hear on your instrument. So when you work on this, be practical. Use the new thing that you're working on and combine it with the things that you know already. You should be able to play the licks in time, and you can also take some of them and try to use them in solos. Once you start composing lines, it will also become obvious why it's unrealistic to think that you can just start using something in time right away. That requires a lot of experience. Let's look at some chromatic notes and also a great alternative to arpeggio inversions. Rules are horrible for music. They almost always backfire, even if they often make sense or work most of the time. One rule that most people will tell beginners in a lesson is that chromatic leading notes should be on the offbeat and resolve on the downbeat. And that is of course sometimes true, but it does also give you some really boring melodies, like this one, which is incredibly uninteresting compared to this. Now here, the difference is of course the leading note that it starts with, so the B before the first C. But the star of the show is definitely that we have the A sharp, which is on the B3, which really just makes the whole thing a lot more exciting. But that doesn't mean that all chromatic leading notes should be on a downbeat. That would be another rule, and that's not really what we're going for. Check out this next example that also helps you hear how jazz lines should not move in the same direction too much. Which of course sounds a lot better than this version where nothing skips around. There are a few things that you can take away from this if you're writing your own licks. Changing direction is often more important than where you put a chromatic leading note, and it's often easier to create melodies that work if you're targeting chord tones with the chromatic notes, not just scale notes. That's also what you will see with the next topic, which is much more powerful than you might imagine. And after that, I'm gonna show you the arpeggio that is the most bebop in the world. If you've listened to jazz, then you probably heard people play this phrase. Joe Pass, Stan Getz and Barry Harris use this very often, and my teacher told me to practice this as an exercise. To me, it sounded incredibly boring, but the concept in there is actually much more powerful than I thought at the time. This is incredibly simple. You have a C major triad, and then you add an enclosure around each note in that triad using a diatonic note above and a chromatic note below. And the same for the next one, diatonic above, chromatic below, and then resolve. What is great about this is not obvious. At least to me, it was anything but obvious. And you will hear people play it very close to the exercise. Joe Pass and Barry Harris do this quite a lot, but I still remember being very surprised when I was learning a George Benson lick and suddenly realized that it was almost entirely based on this exercise, just using a G minor triad. Of course, the fifth is really only using a leading note here, not an enclosure, but you do have an enclosure around the third and also around the root. So in that way, it's really just this enclosure thinking with a G minor triad over that G minor 7 chord. And that's also where this becomes really powerful. I already talked about how important it is to change direction in jazz lines, and that is really how you use this. Check out this example. This is coming out of this basic melody. And then I'm just first adding an enclosure around the C, so. And here notice that it really does sound a lot better to go from the E and then skip down to get this instead of going. And in this case, having more changes of direction in the melody just makes it sound better. And the same is true for the enclosure around the G. Here this sounds better compared to. As you can hear, this exercise is amazing if you use bits of it in a line, much more than it sounds amazing as an exercise or lick in itself. Let's get to that bebop arpeggio. I have to admit that I'm not 100% sure if this arpeggio is more bebop than the triplet arpeggio with the chromatic leading note, so this one. You can let me know in the comments which one you think is the most bebop. As you will see, it's anyway 1,000 times better than arpeggio inversions. I'm talking about the pivot arpeggio, which is an octave displaced way of playing a basic arpeggio. Take this C major 7. If you move the first note up one octave, so this C up to this C, then you get this way of playing the arpeggio. And that has that really nice 6 interval in the beginning, so this, and that just sounds amazing and you can do a lot of great things with it. And this melody is also very common in bebop lines, and you can create great licks like this. Here's one with a long chromatic enclosure. And this works for all chords. Here it is on a D minor 7 in a 2-5-1. Again, it is about creating licks that flow but also have the right type of surprising twists so that they're not boring. And you want to start writing licks with pivot arpeggios to get that into your playing. Now the name pivot arpeggio is something that I learned from Barry Harris. And if you want to get the right phrasing and sound into your lines, then I think his system for using chromatic notes is really where you want to start. It has phrasing and bebop built into it. Check it out in this video, it will change how you play. Learn jazz, make music.